Dr. Cassidy Sugimoto is Assistant Professor of Library and Information Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. Her thesis was awarded the 2011 Eugene Garfield Doctoral Dissertation Fellowship, which I think is really interesting. And she's here to tell us more and open our minds about metrics.
Thank you, Anita. The first title that you've seen talked about novel forms, and we will talk about that and about validation. But I'd also like to emphasize requisite variety. And I think it's nice that I'm coming right after Carol's talk because I think she's made palpable how diverse the scholarly communication ecosystem is, how many different kinds of objects are there and can be tracked and can be measured by a lot of these metrics that are coming out. The first thing I'd like to urge us to do is to get rid of the term altmetrics. I provoke you to do this because I think in many ways the altmetric movement has failed. It's failed to do what it promised that it would do, and the term itself is a misnomer, and not just a misnomer, but a dangerous misnomer. Now, I'm not the first to criticize altmetrics. In 2010, there was a damning Nature editorial that said 2 years on since the publication of the Altmetrics Manifesto, and that was written by Jason Priam, a then doctoral student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, little has changed in academia. Social media has not been taken up as an integral part of the academic measurement of scientific achievement, and there seems to be a lot of skepticism concerning its real value. And resistance to such change is rooted in the fact that these new evaluation methods have not been sufficiently validated to be ready for adoption, and it goes on to talk about the need for evaluation metrics that are standardized and validated. 2 years later, Wouters and Costas did a comprehensive review of all altmetric tools, and they conclude that altmetrics need a far stricter protocol of data quality and indicator reliability and validity before they can be appropriately applied to impact assessment. Again, a focus on reliability and validity. Now, that's one failure, and it's a very important failure that we'll talk about later, but I think that it goes beyond this. There's a failure of the altmetrics movement that's much deeper than an issue of mere reliability and validity. To explain this, let me go back to a little bit of context for those of you who may not have been watching the altmetrics movement so closely. So Jason Priam wrote a chapter in a book I co-edited with Blaise Cronin recently called Beyond Bibliometrics, and he says 3 really important things about altmetrics. One, he says this is an approach to uncovering previously invisible traces of scholarly impact. That is, to make manifest that which was previously invisible, hidden from the public eye. He wants to bring that out. And secondly, he argues that citations miss many important kinds of impacts. And there's where the word alt comes in, right? This is alternative to citation. It's going to supplant citation. It's going to give us a way, a lens, a view into the scholarly ecosystem that citations just couldn't do. And 3, he links citations to this slow, rigid, formal communication system, one that is represented fairly well in this room. And he says, but scientific ideas don't work like that. They don't work like the publishing industry, right? They're nursed, born, raised in messy, fast-moving, informal, invisible colleges. And he goes on to criticize peer review as well in the way that it's done. So he says, altmetrics are going to cure us of that. Simply put, they're going to be a great democratizer of all of these measurements of use and impact of scholarship. And so we can imagine the scholar in the center, and they're doing all of these kinds of activities, right? They teach classes, and there are documents associated with that, right? They produce syllabi. They go to conferences, and we document participant lists. You see one in your handouts there, right? They publish, and we know a lot about that. They collect and analyze data. They discuss. They read things, right? And we can track that with tools like Mendeley. They occasionally have private lives, but not often. And they sometimes communicate with the public, whether they're dancing or not. Now, citations, Jason and others argue, only looks at one part of that, right? Just that publishing part, and just usually one kind of publishing, that is through journal articles. And then it only measures the impact by others who also produce journal articles through citations. So he said it looks at one small point. Well, unfortunately, the reality of altmetrics is that's what they've focused on too. Most of altmetrics has been article-level metrics. They've also looked at publications and also have focused mostly on journal articles. Now, they have opened up the impact a little bit, right? They've said, how many times was your article tweeted, liked on Facebook, read in Mendeley, right? All of these things tell us more about those articles, but we're still focusing on a fairly narrow slice of the activities that a scholar does. So that's why I'd like to turn away from altmetrics and think instead about the notion of requisite variety. right? And for those of you who may not be familiar with cybernetics, the law of requisite variety states that if a system is to be stable, the number of states of its control mechanism must be greater than or equal to the number of the states in the system being controlled. Simply put, that if we have diversity in a system, we also must have diversity in the controls of that system. And for scholarly communication, we control in a lot of ways, right? We control what is produced, we control how it is disseminated, and we control it through analyzing it, through assessment exercises. All of those are functions of control. And if our functions of control are focused on a single kind of producer, a single kind of productivity, a single kind of use, then we've not met all of the potential controls in that system. So we need to think, are we creating tools that can track the requisite variety of the scholarly ecosystem? Now, even within those things that we do, each of those activities is not homogeneous. As we've heard throughout today, if we just look at publishing, that's not a monolith, right? There are lots of different kinds of publishing that we can do. We might publish data, theses, conference papers, journal articles, et cetera, right? We may have software and blogging. How do we track those? How do we take into account that requisite variety? So I'd like to look at a few forms of this as a way to provoke you to think about the systems, the tools that we have, and ask yourself, are we tracking this variety? So first variety comes in the producers. This is a chart from the Science and Engineering Indicators from 2012 that's done by the National Science Foundation, and it tracks the public confidence in different people. So it's not surprising for the US. The military ranks highest in public confidence, but followed by the scientific community. Then it goes on medicine, Supreme Court, and not surprising, Congress is at the lowest point of this confidence chart. But as Foucault famously asked, what does it matter who is speaking? Well, it matters, right? People's confidence in them, the authority that they place matters. But we're turning this on its head in ways through new dissemination vehicles. So Harry Collins asked, are we all scientific experts now? And we have initiatives like TED Talks, which my team has studied fairly extensively. And for TED Talks, we think about this as this great bastion of science communication. Well, only 25% of presenters at TED actually have what we would consider scientific credentials, right? Academic credentials. Most of the people are entrepreneurs, innovators, politicians, entertainers, right? Who are speaking ostensibly on issues of science and technology, right? What does it matter who is speaking? Now, we also have this difference between our producers, who's producing, and the users, and the relationship between those. So this is an old unicist model that was updated, I think in the 70s and then the 90s again. And we have our producers on top, right? And then the producers produce something formal, and it goes through all of these chains, right? And so it made me think of, Williams' authors and readers, right? The space between them. Well, this puts a lot of space between those authors and those readers. We have the users down at the bottom, and it's going through all of these spaces. And we have a little button over there for informal, saying maybe they're talking. But I would argue that we're in a new model now where we are blurring the landscape between what's formal and informal, what's published and what's unpublished, and we're starting to make iterative the relationship between these producers and these consumers, between these authors and these readers. That is that they are producing things rapidly. They may be blogging about something, and a reader chimes in and says, well, have you thought about this? Have you looked at that? And suddenly that becomes a part of that scientific record. When it comes out as a preprint, it's taken that into account. It's changed the text because of its interaction with the consumer. So again, reducing the space between those who are consuming and those who are producing. We're also in a time where we have to reconceptualize micro-attribution, right? Huge numbers of authors on papers and growing areas of collaboration make us ask, are we taking that into account when we're producing different tools and mechanisms to track authorship? Now, this becomes problematic when we think about the notion of a core and periphery in authorship. So for those of you who haven't seen Ioannidis, Boyack, and Clavin's recent work on the continuously publishing core in the scientific workforce, they identified millions of authors in the Scopus database for a 16-year period. And in that, they looked at how many of those people had been continuously publishing, that is, had one publication every year for those 16, and it was less than 1%. Right? Less than 1% were doing that, but they made up nearly half of those publications, right? So you have a very strong core that's doing most of the publishing, getting cited, but they're a small amount of the total number of authors. So when we're creating systems that have author identifiers, we have to take into account this huge amount of transient laborers in the scientific workforce. Who are these people who publish once and then never come back, who publish once every 10 to 20 years? Are we taking those into account in our tools? Now, every author is not alike, nor are they credited alike. This is a study from our gender in authorship where we looked at the last 5 years using Thomson Reuters Web of Science data, and we looked at authorships and whether they were male or female. Now, the bluer the color, the more male-dominated the country, and the pinker, the more female. And as you can see, it's a blue world, right? Now, not only do we have disparities in publishing, it's also disparities in receipt. So women are cited less than men. When a woman is first author on a paper, it's cited less than if a man is first author. If a woman is last author, which is prestigious in other fields, it's also cited less often. So these metrics have to take into account that all producers are not valued equally in these metrics. Now, furthermore, we have to realize that these differences go down to the platform level. So a little bit of background on this study. We took 3,500 images from different scholarly profile sites. So we took Mendeley, Academic Search, and Google Scholar. And we took these images off and we ran them through Mechanical Turk and had them coded on a bunch of variables. One was fairly subjective, right? Do you think this person is male or female? So, I mean, there's the subjectivity of the reviewer in there. How old do you think they are? What race do you think they are? Then objective variables, are they wearing glasses or not? What color is their hair? What color of clothing are they wearing? Right? How much of the person is visible? We ran through all these things, and then we asked them, do you think they're professional? And do you think they're attractive? And now one of the things you'll see, and I'll bring out this platform thing, there's much that I could say about this study, but you'll see that Mendeley is negatively related to professionally. That's a negative predictor. I'm sorry, William. But let me show you why it is because women are seen as significantly more attractive and significantly less professional. So are younger people seen as significantly more attractive and significantly less professional. And Mendeley has a lot of women and a lot of young people, right? So on each of these platforms, when we're talking about readership counts, we have to realize that that's a very different demographic than on Google Scholar, than on Microsoft Academic Search, than on ResearchGate, than on academia.edu. Any metric that you're generating from a single platform has the confines of its user profile, and we need to know more about that user profile. What is the user profile of Twitter? What is the user profile of Facebook? Until we know that, we can't interpret these metrics adequately. So what is being produced, right? We have diversity in the producers, but we also have diversity in the production, right? So yesterday at our meeting, we briefly talked about the makerspace movement, which is a huge movement, particularly in US public libraries and in Australian public libraries. And these spaces allow people to come together and create, right? Do your own bookbinding in the library. You can be a publisher too, they say. Create an instrument, print it out on a 3D printer, come together, have a hackathon, code, create software together. In this way, we are sort of valorizing all of these different kinds of production. And as we do this, those creep into the scientific literature as well. So a study from Thelwell's group at Wolverhampton, they looked at things that were cited in scientific papers. And you can see that in every area, we're increasing the number of references that are coming in, where we're referencing social networking sites, where we're referencing blogs, where we're referencing Wikipedia. The fact that these are being used in scholarship means we need to have better standards, better collections, better databases of these resources as well. Now, this doesn't mean that we're replacing things, right? So people often say, oh, blogs will herald the end of journal articles, or many people made this claim about preprints, right? So you must be familiar with the archive repository. And it has all these preprints, and people have argued multiple times that the astrophysics community could survive just fine if we got rid of journal articles. We don't need them anymore. Everyone relies on archive. So we decided to test this. And what you're seeing here is for 2010 and 2011, the percentages of publications that were on Web of Science that were also on archive. And now for the astronomy and astrophysics category, you're getting around 70%, but that means that 30% never made it onto archive, right? So that's still a considerable amount. And then as you go into the sub-areas, the subdomains, into optics, into chemical physics, then you have a lot fewer that are found on archive at all, meaning that Web of Science is still serving, in the journals that are feeding into that, as the canonical record of science. Now you can see that also in citation patterns. So here what you're seeing are the citations to things that are found in both arXiv and Web of Science, then the arXiv version of that are only on arXiv, that are on arXiv and Web of Science, but the Web of Science version, and then only in Web of Science. And what you see is a huge spike to arXiv in the year that it's put out, right? It's put out there, it's published, people are citing the arXiv version, but then that declines dramatically as soon as the journal article comes out. When the journal article comes out, people move and shift to citing that. That becomes the document of record. So it shows that arXiv is a rapid dissemination vehicle, but it's not serving that place of persistence in the scholarly record. Now, there are a lot of other things that people produce, right? And we've talked about a lot of those. I won't go through all the different things. But we also produce people, and we haven't been very good at tracking that. So one of my areas of research is academic genealogy. And now a lot of people will say, oh, that's probably the grossest form of navel-gazing that you can do, right? Looking at your doctoral grandfather and great-grandfather, and they are all fathers, and how they go through this system. But there are amazing things that we can do when we create that and put that into a database. So I've worked extensively with ProQuest Dissertations and Theses database. And some of the questions that we asked, just to give you an idea, is how does a new field come into being? What is it made out of? So in your first women's studies dissertation, it's obviously not chaired by people in women's studies, it's chaired by people in history and philosophy and political science, right? And how does a field come into being? And then how does it fracture up and specialize? And we can look at that if we can track all of this academic genealogy. Now, it gets even more exciting when you can merge it with other data sets. So we've taken ProQuest and we've merged that with Web of Science data sets, and then we can start seeing really interesting things, right? Do scholars behave in similar ways to their academic grandfathers? Do they take topics and themes? How can we see when a topic is trending or emerging? And these data sets allow us to do that, and particularly integrated data sets. So I imagine a world in which we can take a scholar and we can link all the grants they've ever gotten, all the kinds of publications they've ever had, their demographic characteristics, who they've mentored, and pull that, all of the metrics they've received, whether they're alt or otherwise, and pull them together to really be able to say something about that person in the scholarly ecosystem. Now, there are also changes in how things are being reviewed. Now, all of you in this room will know all of the phases of open peer review and post-peer review, and so I won't go into all of that. You may or may not have seen 6-word peer review, which is a Twitter hashtag where people have to review a paper within a tweet, right? Your bibliography is a giant selfie, too much data, too little evidence. Or this one was actually tweeted by Wellman. How could you not cite Wellman? And these kinds of things, but they're playing around with it, right? These are comical right now, humorous right now, but they're playing around with the notion that we may be able to break apart peer review. Maybe we don't need to have one person reviewing one whole work, right? If a work is created by 100 people and each doing their own little part, shouldn't reviewers also review the one little part on which they're specialized? So we have notions of distributed labor coming into the review system as well, right? Can we distribute that in a way that makes it more efficient, that we don't overburden reviewers? And we have notions of microtasks playing into this. So the increase in scholars who are using Mechanical Turk, for instance, to do their research. Could Mechanical Turk or a like thing staffed with professional scientists also be used to do review? So now to the core of this. How is impact being measured? Well, as I said before, there's a lot of article level things. Now, what we show here is altmetric fueled through Nature. So we have many publishers that are jumping on board and including these kinds of things. Now, they can tell you how many times it's been tweeted or on Facebook or mentioned in the news, and these become really interesting trackers of things on that article level. Now, I have to say there's some caveats, and the altmetric person can clarify on some of these things, but they don't track everything, right? And they're particularly bad at tracking things behind paywalls. So while it might get my Inside Higher Ed reference, it may not get my New York Times or my Chronicle of Higher Education reference, right? So these tools are still not comprehensive, but no tool is, right? And they're working through those issues. Then we have things on the individual, right? So instead of tracking the document, now we're tracking the individual, but still all of their journal articles and their documents around this. This is mentioned a few times together. This is Heather Pavovar and Jason Priam's baby. Impact story, right? They'll create what they call a digital CV for you, at a price, I should note. So this is not exactly a free service that's provided. But again, it's tracking mostly journal article and software. How are we getting the requisite variety of the scholarly ecosystem? And then we have institutional level metrics, right? Mendeley's institutional edition, another place where they're tracking what's happening, primarily though, still around some of these same genres that we've been talking about here. But each of these things are looking at different levels, and they're trying to tell different stories, different narratives for different stakeholders. But the question comes, is that social impact? Right? So the Force 11, which was just promoted, asked that we start measuring true contributions. The REF 2014 asked us to look beyond academia, right, to the social impact. What is the benefit to society, right? What good is it doing? And many people say, well, that's what altmetrics can tell us, right? They can tell us what good it is to society, how much society cares about this. Well, is that a valid assumption? So I'm being funded under the Sloan Foundation right now, together with Vincent Lariviere, Stephanie Haustein, to look at these meanings and motivations. So I'm going to give you just a few examples to help you get thinking about this. So one of the first things anyone does is they want to correlate, like, let's correlate citations to tweets and see if that means anything. So we took a bunch of PubMed things, and we looked at things that were highly cited or not cited at all, and things that were highly tweeted. Now, I'm not sure if you can read these right here, but the first two that we have are regarding the Fukushima accident. Now, in 2011, that was a very timely topic. The fact that they were highly tweeted probably had something to do with that. Then we go down, we see something on Google. Now, if you'll come down a little bit further, you'll see something that was never cited, but has been tweeted 392 times. Right here. Now, just going from the title, penile fracture seems more likely during sex under stressful situations. Now, I am sure that is a very painful and horrible thing. But my guess is it probably wasn't tweeted for its scientific value, right? It was probably tweeted for other reasons, right? How can we make sure that those 392 tweets showed some sort of social impact, right? It would be very hard to cite 392 times about a funny title. Now, we also have something similar to this, right? A physics paper from 2011 that just sort of came onto the internets last year called Can Apparent Superluminal Neutrino Speeds Be Explained as a Quantum Weak Measurement? Now, you can see it's been cited a lot, right? 3,668 times is its altmetric score, which is a composite of all of its things. And now look down to the abstract. Probably not. And that's the extent of the abstract. And now if you pull up the tweets on this, best abstract ever, hilarious abstract, best abstract ever, right? So is its social impact really that high, or is it just hilarious? Right? Another one that we have here, this has an altmetric score of 5,020, right? An actual paper went through the peer review process, was published. Should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here? So a note to you all to remove those things from your documents, right? So these kinds of things bring into question the validity of social media metrics. When you can have an altmetric score in the 5,000s, which is ridiculously high, does that actually show that you've had an impact on society other than entertaining them? So one of the things we've been looking at in our research is the kind of person who is tweeting, the kind of person who is reading on Mendeley, on other accounts, the kind of account that is, and the levels of engagement that they have with the tweet. So, for example, we see a lot of things like this when people are tweeting about science. We have low engagement, which takes the exact title of the work and tweets it and retweets it. So we've just looked, how much does it have the exact title? And then we call high engagement something that doesn't use words from the title, that actually takes a human reader going through and making a comment on the paper, judging its value, changing what it pulls out of it, what its most important things are. And as we've been doing this, we found that the huge majority of tweets are automatic or semi-automatic. These are retweets of the title. These are tweets of the title largely coming from publishers, right, and the publishers of those articles. So what does that say about its social impact when it's highly cited by its own publisher, right? Is that actually a measure of social impact? And how can we create metrics that are sophisticated enough to remove that, to really find the audience for these tweets? All right, so 5 minutes, the future of social media metrics, challenges and opportunities ahead. We're in an era of openness, right? Openness is the word du jour, right? Open metric, open science, open data. We're going to have to take into account the new kinds of variety that come on the scene when we are open. I'd like to come back to this idea, this image of being able to link, right? A lot of the conversation that was at the Tech Trends workshop yesterday was about integration, and integration is going to be the most important thing. Now, many people are working on this but they're working on it individually and not collectively. And it seems to me that a collective approach is what's necessary here. We need standardization, right? And there are examples of this. Open access, we have Spark for IDs. There was ORCID. NISO has been working on standardization for altmetrics. But we need to have standardization in order to use these more efficiently. We also have to be clear that when we are providing access, we're not just amplifying disparities. And this happens a lot when we think about openness and altmetrics and tools, right? The internet is the great democratizer. Well, not exactly. The digital divide actually then tends to exacerbate disparities that we're already seeing in these systems. We have to be really careful to take that into account. And I'll end with this, which I end for most metrics talk, is my favorite, Campbell's Law. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. And I think we have to be careful of this. It's easy to say, oh, there's a new tool out there. I'll throw total impact onto my CV. I'll throw altmetric. I'll use Plum Analytics. I'll throw these things on because they're there. They count something and they're available. But if we are not careful, that leads to incredible goal displacement for researchers, for publishers, for readers. And we need to realize that we are perpetuating those problems and be very careful about the tools that we're using. So with that, I will thank you. Thanks, Sloan, for its funding. Thanks for being invited, and take any questions.
Thank you very much, Cassidy. A very interesting talk, and I hope you will both agree that this will open our minds and set the tone for some discussion. Question there at the back.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. William, right.
Who's first?
Go ahead.
Thank you both for such really, content-rich and packed discussions. I have to admit that I was almost unable to tweet throughout that whole presentation because there were no breaks. It was just a high level of content density in both cases. But what's really come out of this is that when you think of workflows, people have been talking about workflows slightly longer than they've been talking about altmetrics, both key components of change and a new way of doing and assessing scholarship. But whereas, Carol, you had thousands of standards, almost too many standards for overlapping things as part of all of this. We're still at the stage, with altmetrics where we don't have really that many standards of quality and everything. And I was wondering if either of you had any ideas of what we need to do to get, this new way of doing, research assessment of new types of research objects and so on, to the place where we really have it on the firm foundation that it needs to be on to be useful.
So one of the things that I'm trying to do with the research object work is to strip away, because as you say, there's so many standards, there's so many complications. So what we're trying to do is to identify what's the simplest thing that we could possibly represent. And the simplest thing you could possibly do is have something that you can identify some provenance about it and a way of being able to point to other things it's associated with. That's it. So there's a sort of aggregation aspect. And then you can build up more sophisticated profiles. So that's why I kind of tried to get across this idea of progressive profiles. The more you need elaborate information, and if you don't need it, you don't do it. And if you don't understand the complexities of the content from the point of view of the biology in it, because you're not a biologist, you're a library, then you don't use that bit. You just use a sub-piece. So it's a progressive approach. And I think that's really important, that we have this layering. And that's how things like that's how TCP/IP work, that's how the internet works, that's how the web worked. It worked by identifying the least that you have, and then you build up, on top of that, additional aspects or additional services, and you see how you can map it onto other platforms. So you try to identify what's in the waste of the hourglass, and you don't try to do anything outside that. You build that up incrementally. And that is where I think we've gone wrong in the past. We've tried to do not just enough, just in time, but lots of just in case. And we need to abandon the just in case and just do the just enough, just in time for these stakeholders and be much crisper about that.
Did you also want to address that? Thanks.
I think one of the things that I'm excited about is that I'm in the trough of disillusionment right now. Right? I'm excited to be in that place because that means that progress is coming, right? That means that we're going to actually have an understanding of this system. Now, a shameless plug, I just finished a book called Scholarly Metrics Under the Microscope, where we took 40 years of criticisms of bibliometrics. And so we looked very deeply at these criticisms. What has happened? How has it changed over time? And what that did for me was actually recontextualize my criticisms of altmetrics, because I think altmetrics is where bibliometrics was in about 1972. And there are a lot of studies that work to validate citations. And now there's still a lot of criticisms of citations, and in 40 years there will be criticism of altmetrics if they exist. But what it's done is it looked through a lot of more qualitative studies, right? Asking people to look at a text and say, why did you cite something here? Why did you cite something here? What are you doing? And I think we're going back to those same metrics for altmetrics as well, those same measurements to say, okay, why are you saving this on Mendeley? What does that mean to you, right? And I think we have to ask our users what they're doing and why. So for a quick example, in citation analysis, the biggest fear was, all of these negative citations, right? People are citing this work because they disagree with it, and we shouldn't give them a bunch of kudos for that. And in the studies, they found that this was less than 5% of citations were actually negative citations. And when they were fueling whole areas of inquiry because people disagreed so much, right? People don't just disagree with a paper because it's only all right? Should we cite that crappy paper here, right? We don't cite the crappy paper, we leave it out. And I think we'll see the same kinds of things in order to build standards around social media metrics.
Great. There's a question in the back. Yeah, thanks. Could you introduce yourself very briefly?
Yeah,
Thanks.
I'm Kaveh from River Valley. Firstly, I had no idea that all the young, attractive women were on Mendeley. Now we know William. But seriously, listening to both talks, it seems giving the impact, working out the impact of a work is getting more and more complicated. It's just very difficult to enumerate that. So isn't one way to simply just have a system like, say, Stack Exchange, where the community uprates or downrates the contribution of scientists, which is, I think, is something that's very difficult to game, and it'll be a sort of fair indication of who is contributing. Otherwise, it's just getting almost impossible to have any idea of who is contributing.
My concern with a lot of those is, again, the filter bubble that's been talked about before, right? A Reddit model of thumbsing up and thumbs down. We get to a very elite core of things. And my concern is that again, exacerbates disparities in the scientific workforce and in scientific communication. Now, could there be other models? Yes, absolutely. But I would be skeptical of any that sort of cream off things and rely on people's interaction, because as we've talked about before today, incentives become a huge part of this, and post-publication and even open publication systems have failed miserably because of a lack of incentive structures. So putting things out there and hoping that people will come and sift through them may be a bit too idealistic right now, but could we investigate those systems? Certainly.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but I want to briefly give both of our speakers a hand, and they will be around for the questions.